Hi, I hope you people got a chance to complete the hands-on exercises of object life cycle. In case you have not completed, what I say is just one thing. I hope you know by now. Please pause the video, go back, do the exercise and come back. Doing the exercises are very much important in our journey of learning any programming for that matter. All right. And I hope you have completed this. So now let us go to the next chapter, which is about variables, methods and properties. So we'll understand the differences between these three elements. And also under properties, we have three types known as a read-write property, read-only property and a write-only property. We'll discuss about these concepts in this particular chapter. Let us understand in detail the variables, methods and properties of a class. So now let us look at what is a variable. So we have already discussed that there are different types of variables. So one is a class variable. So class variable is nothing but a variable which is declared as a static or a constant value. So this is defined by specifying a static keyword, and it is created when the class is loaded. So we don't need to create an object to really set the value of a static variable or access the value of a static variable, which is typically public by default. Then we do have instance variables. So instance variable is a very important element in a class. So which is nothing but a member variable. Okay, let me just go here. Okay, it's a member variable of a class. Okay, and typically it can be a primitive like an integer or a string, or it can also be a separate reference type. For example, I have a student class. Let's take an example, and student has residential address. Let's take a simple example, and address is not something like a simple one line or a string cannot represent an address. Typically it will be a structure like you have address line number 1, line number 2, city, state, pin code, etc., or a zip code, etc. All right. So that's where we can also create a separate class called address and have a reference object address associated with this particular student class. So this is very much possible. Then we do have the instance variable, which can be created and optionally initialized when the object is created, which we saw in the constructor. And then so typically initialized in constructors, and we have these variables which are typically private in nature, and they can have default initialization as well, wherein by default they can have a value represented as a default value in the system, and then they can be accessed by all the methods of the class, and generally the value of these variables are managed by the objects itself. So they maintain the valid data for a given object, which is referred to as a state. So remember, in the previous chapter we were discussing about the state in the object lifecycle. So the total value of all the instance variables, so all the total the individual values rather, not just total. I'm not really meaning a sum. So all the object variables put together represent the state of an object. And how do they get manipulated? So the data gets manipulated via a method invocation or when some property is invoked. So that's a basic concept. We'll discuss about these things in detail. And then a class may or may not have an instance variable. So that is very much possible, though generally we see that classes will have instance variable, and when they have an instance variable, it is called stateful object, which maintains the state of a particular client application. And when it does not have any instance variable, we call it as stateless. So stateless and stateful are important terminologies in programming. We'll discuss and explore them in further courses. All right, so this is about instance variables. Next, we do have method variables. What are method variables? They are declared within a method. So when you create a method, you can create some variables. For example, it could be you're doing some looping. Let's take an example, and I create a variable I, and that is what is declared within a method, and they gets created when the method is executed. and they cannot be accessed outside the method. So this is basically important. So well, within the method, they can be accessible. Next is a variable scopes. So based on these three options like class variables, instance and method variables, you could just refer here as a graphically represented what are the scopes. So the class scope is accessible everywhere. So we have this class variables, and then we have the instance variable. So if there are any set of instances, so if there are three instances, they have their own copies of those variables. So that's a basic concept. And whenever you invoke a method, the respective method related variables will also be created. So these are the different scopes which are part of Java class. And then we do have this keyword. So this keyword refers to the current object that we are basically referring and represents the current instance of the class. Okay. This variable is typically used to access or modify the fields of a current object. So this is very much useful. You would have seen this in constructor implementation, where we use this dot width is equal to the width, which is basically parameter which is being invoked, sent, passed as a parameter, and this dot height. So this is a simple example. And also sometimes we can use this keyword for invoking the methods well within the current object. So it's just a reference to the current object which can be used well within the respective methods of a particular class. Next is about the methods. So what is a method? So method is nothing but encapsulation of some logic which actually depicts the behavior of a class and implements a functionality or some business logic. For example, rectangle class implemented a method called getArea, so which actually computed the area and returned the area of a particular object. Then it works on the instance data. So we already have the data encapsulated within the particular class, and it works within that particular data. So that's very much important. So if you have two rectangle objects, and getArea of the respective objects will actually work on those two objects' respective data, so that it can reveal the core responsibilities of a particular class. So primarily, methods are very much important for a particular class. And we have a special type of method called properties. So a class can also have certain attributes or fields. So what is a field or an attribute? So let us take an example of a class like a student. So whenever we say student, a student class basically will have certain fields which represents a student, like it could have first name of the student, last name of the student, date of birth, etc, etc, etc. So these are some of the example fields associated with an entity which is referred to as property, and generally express the characteristics of a particular object. In addition to this, we do have a property which actually provides access to the member variable. So essentially, properties are nothing but methods or special methods, generally referred to as a getter and setter method. So typically accessed using getter and setter. For example, I can have get first name or set first name, something like that, or get last name, set last name. So this is a simple example of how I can create a method. So it is a specialized method. Okay. So many times we see that attributes, properties and instance variables are also being interchangeably used in some literature, but in general, so it's a property could be something like a method in Java which actually modifies or mutates or returns the value of a particular attribute, and typically can be public. So we can basically have properties as public, but generally not recommended. So getters and setters methods are generally recommended to be used in Java. So based on this, there are three types of properties that we can see. So we can have a read-write property. Say for example, you have a class called employee. So employee object dot get first name. So first name is a property. So where you have get first name, set first name. So this is a read-write property. Next, we do have a write-only property. For example, employee dot set password. I don't want get password implemented there, because if I implement get password for an employee object, it is possible that I can invoke and get the actual password of that particular object. So it violates security, right? For example, let me give a real world example here for you. Let us say Aadhaar. So in India, we use Aadhaar as a unique identification for every citizen, and it is mandatory to have Aadhaar typically and recommended to be used in various transactions. So you can actually capture the biometric, or rather when you create an Aadhaar card, or when you apply for an Aadhaar card, they will take the biometrics and take the fingerprints and use the fingerprints to really authenticate and validate that you are doing that particular transaction. So now comes the question, can the Aadhaar system return the fingerprints when somebody asks for it? Not really. Do you agree? So they can be used only to validate whether you are the right person using this particular transaction or doing this particular transaction. So this is a very simple example of write-only property. Whereas there are certain properties like address. So I want to basically know where you are living. So I can retrieve, or I can update. Mobile number of that particular citizen can be updated also. So I can also retrieve the mobile number. I could also update. So that is an example of read-write property. Similarly, there could be some read-only properties as well. A classic example here could be employee dot get net salary. So it should not happen that directly somebody goes and updates the salary. So I want to just ensure that it is a read-only field. So this is a simple example of the different categories of properties that we can basically have. In the next chapter, we will take up a simple hands-on exercise where we will discuss about the differences between variables, methods, and properties for a class, so that you'll get a better understanding of these concepts. Stay tuned.